was 2009. This story really happened. When I think back to that morning, there was nothing to suggest the horror that would follow. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table, the pale winter light filtering through the window. Steam rose from the mug of tea in her hands, and for a moment, she looked so serene. I remember the muffled sound of the wind outside, the forewarning of the storm the news had been talking about. "Are you still going on the hike today?" I asked. My voice sounded distant, as if I already knew the answer. She smiled, that stubborn smile she inherited from her father. "Mom, I'll be fine. I've done this trail plenty of times." Clara always loved winter. Unlike me, who always feared the long, silent days of snowstorms, she found comfort in the relentless white of the landscape, as if the cold warmed her from the inside out. Still, something about that morning didn't feel right. I hesitated for a second and almost said, "Stay home today." But as always, I stayed silent. She put on her heavy boots and her favorite red coat, a red so vivid it seemed out of place in that monochromatic world. Before leaving, she turned and hugged me. A long, unexpected hug, as if something inside her knew it would be the last. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, sweetheart. Don't take too long, please." Clara stepped out the door and disappeared into the morning fog. The hours that followed were filled with that oppressive silence that only a winter storm can bring. As the snow began to fall harder, worry settled in my stomach like a knot. I glanced at the clock countless times, tried watching TV to distract myself, but the sound of each gust of wind made me shiver. At 5 p.m., when Clara still hadn't returned, I called her for the first time. The call went straight to voicemail. "She must be out of signal," I murmured to myself, trying to convince myself, but every passing minute was a silent scream that something was wrong. By 7 p.m., with the sky darkened and the storm roaring outside, I lost any hope of calming myself. I called the ski station, my voice trembling and urgent. "My daughter hasn't returned from the trail. She left early this morning, alone. Her name is Clara." I can still hear the sound of the blizzard, the muffled echo over the phone, as the man on the other end responded with a calm that felt unbearable. "We'll send a rescue team, ma'am, but it might be difficult in this weather." Those words sounded like a sentence. By the time the rescuers arrived, the storm had already turned the world into an indifferent white wall. They followed Clara's usual trail, but her tracks had disappeared, erased by the snowstorm. The team found only small clues, a broken ski pole, buried in the snow, and a partial impression of boots that didn't go far. But no Clara. I stood at the door, watching the men return one by one, their flashlights creating ghostly halos in the darkness. One of them handed me the ski pole, and in that instant, I felt as if the world had stopped spinning. "She's still out there," I whispered. No one answered. In the days that followed, the house became silent, more silent than ever. The phone rang every hour. Family, friends, volunteers offering help. But deep down, I knew. Something more had happened. It wasn't just the storm. Clara was too careful, too experienced to simply disappear. That's when the letter arrived. A brown envelope addressed to me with no return address. By the time I opened it, my hands were already shaking, as if my body knew before my eyes. The first words were written in fine, almost delicate handwriting. "You didn't pay attention to the signs." I did. The letter continued, describing details no one could possibly know. He knew the exact time Clara used to leave. He described the red coat she was wearing, the poles she carried, even the music she was listening to in her headphones as she walked. And then, the final sentence. "The storm only helped me take her. You'll never find her." The paper fell from my hands, and I felt paralyzed, as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. The nights after the letter arrived became torment. The silence, which once had been a balm of tranquility, now hissed in every corner of the house. I found myself staring at the dark windows, as if expecting to see Clara's face reflected outside, amidst the darkness and snow. But all I saw were shadows, some real, others born from my exhaustion. The police came the next day. 2 men with compassionate looks, but empty of answers. One of them held the letter as though it were a bomb about to explode. "We'll investigate the source, ma'am," he said with practiced calm. "But it could be someone playing a prank, some disturbed person." Disturbed. The word echoed in me. I looked at him in disbelief. That letter was real. Who else would know those details? "This isn't a joke. This person saw my daughter. They followed her. They promised they'd do what they could." Nothing more than that. When they left, I took the letter back to the kitchen and sat at the table where Clara had last been. I read every line again, as if I could find something I'd missed. Each word felt like it pierced me. "You didn't pay attention to the signs." What signs? I began remembering moments, small fragments that had once seemed irrelevant. That time, 2 months ago, when Clara said she'd heard footsteps behind her on the trail. She laughed, saying it was probably a squirrel or a deer, but there had been hesitation in her voice. Or that other time we found a boot print near our cabin in the fresh snow. A print that didn't belong to either of us. I remember saying, "It must have been some lost tourist." Clara looked at me but didn't respond. Did she know? Did she feel something watching her but chose to ignore it, afraid of seeming paranoid? The truth hit me like a punch to the stomach. My daughter hadn't been alone in those last months. She was hunted. The search efforts continued, but they always came back empty. Helicopters flew over the mountain. Volunteer teams combed through the trails even with the risk of snow. Every day without news was another death for me. One night I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, as though something whispered through the walls. I went downstairs to the living room, where the phone sat. I still held on to hope that I'd hear a miracle on the other end of the line. But instead, I saw something that made my heart stop. Pinned to the front door was a new envelope, exactly like the first. I ran to it, my hands trembling. I tore it open, and inside was a single photograph. It was Clara. She was facing away, walking down the trail in her red coat, her fresh footprints in the snow. Further in the background, a dark figure stood out, a blurred silhouette hidden among the trees. He was there, just meters behind her, watching. On the back of the photo, there was a short sentence. "I told you I was close." I dropped the photo as if it burned me. My breath caught and my body began to tremble. I ran to the windows, locking them one by one. I checked the front door's lock. I pulled back the curtains to look outside. But all I saw was the empty white of the snow stretching out like a shroud. "Who are you?" I whispered, though no one could hear me. In that moment, I realized something even worse. The stalker hadn't left. He was still here, watching. Maybe from the forest, maybe from closer. Maybe he was standing right there, looking at me through the darkness. That night was the last time I ever looked out the windows. The days that followed were a blur. The police returned, this time with more questions. I showed them the photo, but they only exchanged glances among themselves. One of them asked if Clara had issues with any ex-boyfriend, any co-worker. I wanted to scream, as if it were her fault, as if she had invited that thing into her life. "It doesn't matter who he is," I said angrily. "He's here. He's still here." They said they'd patrol the area, but I knew it would be useless. His presence was something deeper, more calculated. He knew where we were. He knew how to hurt us. And I knew, deep in my heart, that he wasn't finished. The days turned into weeks and the snow continued to fall relentlessly, like a white veil covering a wound that would never heal. Clara didn't come back, and that man, that thing, that took her was still around. I could feel it. It was an invisible presence like a cold weight on my shoulders. I could no longer sleep, nor eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photo. Clara walking on the trail, the dark figure in the background, the shadow that hunted her. That's when the noises started. In the dead of night, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, on the wooden floorboards. First downstairs, then in the hallway on the second floor. The house creaked, and the sound was too faint to be the wind. One night, I woke up with a jolt, convinced someone was inside the house. I grabbed the bedside lamp as if it were a weapon and went down the stairs. Everything was dark, cold. And then, on the front door, I saw it. Someone had left handprints in the fresh snow, pressed against the glass of the window. 5 long, deformed fingers, as if winter itself had touched the house. I ran to lock every door, every window. But I knew it was useless. He was too close. The house wouldn't protect me. I could feel him, watching me, waiting for my sanity to break. The next day, my eldest son, Lucas, came to visit me. He was worried, and I could see in his face that he thought I was losing my mind. "Mom, you need to rest," he said, sitting across from me. His eyes studied my every move, as if searching for a flaw. "This is tearing you apart. The police are handling it." "You don't understand," I shouted, my voice trembling. "He's here. He's still here, Lucas. Don't you see? He took your sister and now he's waiting for me to break." Lucas looked at me with compassion, but also with that silent fear, like he was staring at someone sick. "I'll keep an eye out, Mom. I'll watch the house." He didn't believe me. Nobody did. That night, something changed. I was sitting in the armchair in the living room, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, when I heard it. A whisper coming from the window. Not words, just a faint murmur, as if the wind carried a voice that shouldn't exist. Slowly, I turned my head toward the glass. And there he was. A dark silhouette, standing at the edge of the forest, unmoving like a statue. The figure had no face, just a void that seemed to consume me from the inside out. He stood there, staring at me. He wanted me to know he was there, that he had never left. I felt a sob escape. My mind spun. Lucas had to see. He had to believe me. "Lucas," I screamed, running up the stairs. "Lucas, come here, quick." But when I reached his room, the bed was empty. The sheets were still rumpled, but he wasn't there. The window was open, and the wind blew in, carrying snowflakes and the distant sound of something dragging. On the windowsill there was a photo. It was Lucas. He was in the backyard, standing in the same spot where the figure had been minutes earlier. Behind him, almost invisible in the shadow, was him. The photo fell from my hands, and I collapsed onto the floor. My breath came short. My vision pulsed. "No, no," I murmured. In the days that followed, no one found Lucas. Like Clara, he simply vanished. The police came back, the same tired faces, the same empty questions. They didn't believe me. They said I was delusional, that grief had consumed me. Maybe they were right. Now I'm alone in this house. The silence is absolute except for the whispers that sometimes come with the wind. All the windows are locked, all the doors sealed. But I know he's here. He never left. I see him in the shadows of the hallway. I hear his footsteps on the roof at night. He took my children. He took my sanity. And now he waits, just waiting for me to finally surrender to him. I no longer sleep. I no longer eat. I just listen. Sometimes when I look out the window, I see tracks in the snow. They start in the forest and come up to my door, but they never leave. They just stay there, waiting for me to open. And maybe soon, I will. Because now I understand. There's no escaping him. Now I wonder, is any of this even real? The days turned into weeks, and the snow continued to fall relentlessly, like a white veil covering a wound that would never heal. Clara didn't come back, and that man, that thing, that took her was still around. I could feel it. It was an invisible presence, like a cold weight on my shoulders. I could no longer sleep, nor eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photo. Clara walking on the trail, the dark figure in the background, the shadow that hunted her. That's when the noises started. In the dead of night, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, on the wooden floorboards. First downstairs, then in the hallway on the second floor. The house creaked, and the sound was too faint to be the wind. One night I woke up with a jolt, convinced someone was inside the house. I grabbed the bedside lamp as if it were a weapon and went down the stairs. Everything was dark, cold. And then, on the front door, I saw it. Someone had left handprints in the fresh snow, pressed against the glass of the window. 5 long, deformed fingers, as if winter itself had touched the house. I ran to lock every door, every window, but I knew it was useless. He was too close. The house wouldn't protect me. I could feel him watching me, waiting for my sanity to break. The next day, my eldest son, Lucas, came to visit me. He was worried, and I could see in his face that he thought I was losing my mind. "Mom, you need to rest," he said, sitting across from me. His eyes studied my every move as if searching for a flaw. "This is tearing you apart. The police are handling it." "You don't understand," I shouted, my voice trembling. "He's here. He's still here, Lucas. Don't you see? He took your sister, and now he's waiting for me to break." Lucas looked at me with compassion, but also with that silent fear, like he was staring at someone sick. "I'll keep an eye out, Mom. I'll watch the house." He didn't believe me. Nobody did. That night, something changed. I was sitting in the armchair in the living room, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, when I heard it. A whisper coming from the window. Not words, just a faint murmur, as if the wind carried a voice that shouldn't exist. Slowly, I turned my head toward the glass. And there he was, a dark silhouette, standing at the edge of the forest, unmoving like a statue. The figure had no face, just a void that seemed to consume me from the inside out. He stood there, staring at me. He wanted me to know he was there, that he had never left. I felt a sob escape. My mind spun. Lucas had to see. He had to believe me. "Lucas!" I screamed, running up the stairs. "Lucas, come here! Quick!" But when I reached his room, the bed was empty. The sheets were still rumpled, but he wasn't there. The window was open, and the wind blew in, carrying snowflakes and the distant sound of something dragging. On the windowsill, there was a photo. It was Lucas. He was in the backyard, standing in the same spot where the figure had been minutes earlier. Behind him, almost invisible in the shadow, was him. The photo fell from my hands, and I collapsed onto the floor. My breath came short. My vision pulsed. No, I murmured. In the days that followed, no one found Lucas. Like Clara, he simply vanished. The police came back, the same tired faces, the same empty questions. They didn't believe me. They said I was delusional, that grief had consumed me. Maybe they were right. Now I'm alone in this house. The silence is absolute, except for the whispers that sometimes come with the wind. All the windows are locked, all the doors sealed. But I know he's here. He never left. I see him in the shadows of the hallway. I hear his footsteps on the roof at night. He took my children. He took my sanity. And now he waits, just waiting for me to finally surrender to him. I no longer sleep. I no longer eat. I just listen. Sometimes when I look out the window, I see tracks in the snow. They start in the forest and come up to my door, but they never leave. They just stay there waiting for me to open. And maybe soon, I will. Because now I understand. There's no escaping him. Now I wonder, is any of this even real? When I first moved to the old countryside house, I welcomed the isolation. After my divorce, I wanted distance. Distance from him, from the memories, and from the life I used to have. The house was modest, but surrounded by snow-covered fields and woods that stretched for miles. To me, it felt like a clean slate, quiet and safe. The first time I noticed the footprints, I was sitting by the window with a cup of coffee. It had snowed heavily the night before, leaving a pristine white blanket over everything. But there they were, footprints. They started at the edge of the woods, circled around the house, and stopped directly beneath my bedroom window. I froze, the coffee burning my throat as I swallowed. Must be a hunter, I told myself, or perhaps a neighbor passing through, though I hadn't met anyone in the weeks I'd been here. I tried to shake it off. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard something, a faint, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, like fingers tapping on glass. I held my breath and stared at the window across the room. It was too dark to see, but the sound stopped after a few seconds. I didn't sleep much that night. The footprints came back the next morning, more of them this time. They circled the house twice, stopping at every window and door. My stomach turned as I followed the trail outside, feeling the snow crunch beneath my boots. Probably kids, I muttered, though deep down I knew better. Who would be wandering the fields at night in temperatures cold enough to freeze skin? The next few nights were worse. At first it was the tapping again. Then came faint creaking from the wooden floorboards downstairs. I'd lie in bed, blankets pulled up to my chin, listening to the house breathe around me. By morning, new footprints would appear, closer to the house each time. On the fifth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I dug out an old security camera and set it to monitor the front yard. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The tapping. This time, louder, more deliberate. I gripped the handle of a kitchen knife under my pillow and waited for dawn. The next morning, I replayed the camera footage. At first, nothing. Just snowflakes drifting past the lens. Then I saw him. A figure stepped into view from the woods, slow and deliberate. He walked to the house and stood motionless in front of the bedroom window for over an hour. I couldn't see his face clearly, but the way he stood, his posture, it felt familiar. My stomach twisted into knots. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. My days were spent pacing the house, and every shadow I caught in the corner of my eye sent my heart racing. I didn't bother calling the police. The nearest station was an hour away, and what would I even say? That footprints were scaring me? Then, one night, I woke up to an icy draft. My bedroom door was open, swaying slightly as though someone had just passed through it. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and moved downstairs, my bare feet nearly slipping on the cold wooden floor. In the living room, the front door was ajar. Snow had blown in, leaving a trail of wet, heavy footprints leading inside. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I followed them, through the kitchen, down the hall, and finally to my bedroom closet. I stood there, staring at the door. I couldn't hear anything, but I felt something, a presence. I swallowed hard and flung the closet door open. No one, just a piece of folded paper on the floor. Slowly, I picked it up and unfolded it. My vision blurred as I read the words, written in the unmistakable handwriting of my ex-husband. "You'll never escape me, Sarah." I don't remember much after that. I must have screamed, though no one heard me. I called the police the next morning, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no footprints inside the house. I told them about the note, but it had vanished. They looked at me like I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. I sold the house and moved back to the city. I thought being around people would help, but it didn't. I see him everywhere now. In every shadow, in every face on the street. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and feel someone watching me. I keep the knife under my pillow. I keep the lights on. But it doesn't matter. He's out there somewhere, and I know he's waiting. He told me I'd never escape him. And deep down, I believe him. I moved into the old countryside house in late January, craving isolation after the divorce. The air was sharp and cold, the fields blanketed in snow that stretched into endless woods. Out here there were no neighbors, no noise, and no memories of him. Just me and the quiet. The first time I noticed the footprints was on a Thursday morning. I was at the kitchen window stirring a mug of coffee when something outside caught my eye, a line of footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. I hadn't left the house in days. The prints started at the tree line, perfectly spaced, and circled the house once before stopping beneath my bedroom window. I felt a strange prickle on my skin, like someone was watching me. "Probably a hiker," I muttered aloud, as if hearing my own voice would make it true. Still, the image of someone standing beneath my window, staring up at me, settled uneasily in my mind. That night, the house felt different. Every creak of the wood and whisper of the wind made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint sound. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, deliberate. It was coming from the bedroom window. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up, barely daring to move. I couldn't see anything outside. The darkness was too thick. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped. I told myself it was just the wind. The footprints were back the next morning, more of them this time. They circled the house twice and stopped by each window. Perfect prints, perfectly spaced. It was as though someone had been examining the house. The snow had made everything silent, muffled. I stood outside in my boots, staring at the marks in the snow, feeling suddenly exposed, like an animal caught in the open. Over the next few nights, the disturbances grew worse. I heard floorboards creaking softly downstairs when I was sure I was alone. Once, I found the back door unlocked in the morning, though I remembered locking it. The footprints never stopped. They appeared every night without fail, tracing slow, deliberate paths around the house. By the fifth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I dug out an old security camera I'd brought from the city and set it up in the front yard, pointed directly at my window. "Whoever you are," I whispered to the empty room, "I'll see you." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the window, clutching the handle of a kitchen knife beneath the covers. Around 3 a.m., the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, eyes wide, counting the seconds until it stopped. At dawn, I forced myself to check the camera footage. My hands shook as I clicked through the night's recording. For the first few hours, nothing. Just snow falling softly in the beam of the camera's light. Then, at 2:47 a.m., a figure stepped into view from the edge of the woods. My stomach dropped. The person moved slowly, deliberately, leaving crisp footprints behind. He walked straight to the house and stopped beneath my window, tilting his head back to look up. Though the image was grainy, I recognized the stance, the way he stood, even the shape of his shoulders. It was him, my ex-husband. I felt like I was going to be sick. I stared at the screen, replaying the moment over and over as dread pooled in my chest. He'd found me. I tried calling the police, but the line was dead. I grabbed my coat and keys, ready to drive to town, but the car wouldn't start. My breath fogged the air as I sat behind the wheel, trembling. I was trapped. That night I barricaded the doors and windows. I pushed furniture against the doors, checked every lock twice. I kept the knife close, my heart pounding with every small sound the house made. At 3 a.m., I woke up again. The air felt different, colder. I sat up, and my stomach dropped. My bedroom door was open. I was sure I'd closed it. I grabbed the flashlight and crept downstairs, knife shaking in my hand. The front door was ajar, a sharp draft blowing snow inside. Footprints, wet, heavy footprints, led from the doorway down the hall, to my bedroom. I followed them back upstairs, my flashlight beam bouncing on the walls. The prints stopped at my bedroom closet. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. I could hear it, soft breathing, coming from inside. I swallowed hard, raised the knife, and threw the closet door open. There was no one there, but on the floor, neatly placed in the center of the closet, was a piece of folded paper. My hands shook as I opened it. Written in his handwriting were 5 words. "You'll never escape me, Sarah." The police found no evidence. No one had broken in, they said. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints inside the house. They didn't believe me. I left the countryside the next day. I couldn't stay. But even now, back in the city, I can't escape him. I see his face in every crowd. I hear faint tapping on my windows at night. I wake up to my bedroom door open when I'm sure I'd locked it. I know he's out there somewhere, watching me, waiting. And every time I close my eyes, I hear his voice in my mind, repeating those words like a curse. "You'll never escape me." I don't remember leaving the house. I don't remember the drive back to the city either. It was as if my body went on autopilot, and my mind, My mind was somewhere else entirely. I rented a small apartment, a boxy, suffocating thing on the third floor of an old building where the pipes rattled and the neighbors fought through thin walls. I told myself I'd feel safer here, surrounded by people, surrounded by noise. But the noise didn't help. It just made me jump more. Every knock on the wall, every voice in the hall, every sound outside my window sent me spiraling. I triple-checked the locks every night. I lined the door with salt like some absurd superstition. And still, it wasn't enough. It started small. The first time I woke up to find my bedroom window open, though I swore I had shut it before bed. Snow blew in across the sill, a single, thin line of footprints visible on the fire escape outside. My heart pounded in my throat, but I told myself it was nothing. A prank. A coincidence. But then there were the letters. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in ink I knew too well. The first one contained a single word. Soon. The second came a week later. Close. I brought them to the police, shaking with fear. They were polite, but I saw the look in their eyes. Pity mixed with doubt. They told me there wasn't much they could do. No threats, they said. It's probably someone messing with you. I wanted to scream. It was a Friday when I reached my breaking point. I'd spent the day hiding in my apartment, curtains drawn tight, lights off. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. My phone sat beside me, dead. I hadn't charged it for days. I couldn't stand the idea of anyone being able to call me. Around midnight I heard it, tap, tap, tap. At first I thought it was my imagination. The sound was faint, rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. My stomach twisted into knots as I crept across the room. I didn't want to look, but something in me had to. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see. There, standing on the fire escape in the snow, was a man. His silhouette was backlit by the streetlights, but I knew. I didn't need to see his face to know who it was. He was looking right at me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in sharp gasps as the tapping started again. Faster now, louder. Bang, bang, bang. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen and ran to the door. My hands fumbled with the locks, but I couldn't get them open. Then everything stopped. The knocking, the tapping, the breathing. The silence was worse. Slowly, I turned back toward the window. It was empty. The fire escape was clear, covered in fresh snow that glowed in the moonlight. And there, written in the snow on the glass, was a single word, traced by a finger from the outside. Mine. I don't know how long I sat on the floor that night shaking. Days? Hours? It didn't matter. I haven't told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? The police think I'm paranoid. My friends think I need therapy. Maybe they're right. I haven't seen him again. Not yet. But I feel him. He's always there, just out of sight, just out of reach. Every time I hear footsteps in the hallway or tapping on the glass, I freeze. Every time I close my eyes, I see him standing there, staring. I know he's not gone. I'll never escape him. And somehow, I think that's exactly what he wants. I didn't want to spend New Year's Eve in New York. Not this year. The city was suffocating. Bright lights, loud crowds, and happy couples everywhere. I wasn't ready for all that cheer. My breakup was still fresh, and honestly, I felt like I was drowning in my own routine. Work, sleep, repeat. So when I saw the listing for a quiet cabin upstate, I didn't think twice. Cozy getaway in the middle of nowhere. Perfect for a peaceful retreat. Exactly what I needed. The drive up was long and monotonous. I left the city early, watching skyscrapers fade into snowy fields and leafless trees. By the time I reached the narrow road that led to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low, spilling orange light over everything. The road twisted through dense woods, and for the first time in months I felt calm. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked into a clearing at the end of the road. It was small but charming. Dark wooden walls, a wraparound porch, and a single chimney puffing faint smoke. The caretaker, an older man named Henry, was waiting for me by his truck. "You're lucky the snow didn't hit harder," he said, as I stepped out of the car. His voice was gruff, and he avoided looking directly at me. You wouldn't have gotten in otherwise. It's perfect, I said, forcing a smile. Exactly what I needed. Henry handed me the keys and gave me a brief tour. The interior was warm and rustic, a stone fireplace in the living room, a small kitchen with mismatched dishes, and a bedroom upstairs. Simple and quiet. Perfect. Cell service is spotty out here, Henry said as we walked back to the porch. There's a landline, though, in case of emergencies. Wood stocked for the fire and the heater's working fine. Should be comfortable. Thank you, I replied, feeling oddly relieved when he finally started his truck. Something about him made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite place it. Enjoy your solitude, he said before driving off, his tires crunching over the snow. That first evening was everything I'd hoped for. I built a fire, brewed some tea, and curled up with a blanket and a book. Outside, snow fell steadily, coating the cabin in a soft, white hush. It was the kind of silence you could feel. No cars, no voices, just the crackle of wood burning and the occasional whistle of wind. Around 10 p.m., I stepped outside for some fresh air. The night was pitch black, the forest a shadowy wall around me. My breath misted in the cold as I listened to the quiet. For a moment I felt like I was the last person on earth. Then, somewhere in the darkness, I heard it. A sound, soft and faint. Crunch, crunch. Footsteps. I froze, my heart jumping into my throat. It could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but as I strained to hear, the sound was too deliberate. 2 steps. Then silence. I squinted into the dark, trying to see past the porch light's faint glow. Hello? I called, feeling stupid the moment I said it. Of course, no one would answer. The sound stopped. I waited another minute before shaking it off and stepping back inside, locking the door behind me. It's just your imagination, I told myself. Or maybe a raccoon. But as I climbed into bed an hour later, the sound lingered in my mind. Crunch, crunch. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. This time, they were closer. The sound was unmistakable this time. Footsteps. Slow and heavy, moving just outside the cabin walls. My eyes shot open, and I held my breath, heart thundering in my chest. The clock on the nightstand read 2:47 a.m. The fire downstairs had burned low, and the room was freezing. I sat up, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing, just the creaks of the cabin settling and the wind outside. Maybe I imagined it. Sleep-deprived and jumpy, I had been on edge since arriving, but then I heard it again. Crunch, crunch, like someone stepping carefully in the snow. My mind raced. It's an animal, I told myself, clutching the blanket tightly. It has to be. But animals didn't move like that. They didn't pause between steps, as if listening. I slid out of bed, wincing as the floorboards groaned beneath me. Grabbing the heavy flashlight I'd seen earlier in the kitchen, I crept down the stairs, every step agonizingly slow. The cabin was dark except for the faint orange glow of the dying fire. Shadows flickered on the walls as I passed. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. Do I really want to check? Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, but the sound was maddening. I had to know. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and opened it just a crack. The cold hit me first, sharp and biting. I shined the flashlight out onto the snow-covered clearing. At first, I saw nothing, just the white blanket of snow perfectly undisturbed. Then I turned the beam slightly to the left, and my stomach dropped. Footprints. They started at the edge of the clearing where the forest began, leading toward the cabin. The prints were deep, spaced apart as though whoever made them had been walking slowly. They continued straight to the porch steps, where I was now standing, then stopped. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. Just blackness, silent and still. My pulse hammered in my ears. They were here. Someone was here. Shutting the door quickly, I locked it and checked it twice before turning to inspect the windows, all locked. Still, The feeling of exposure prickled at me like needles. Someone had stood out there, watching me. The next morning, I told myself it had all been in my head. Lack of sleep, overactive imagination. When you're alone in the woods, even the most ordinary noises can feel sinister. I went about the morning as normally as I could. Coffee, a fire in the fireplace, a book I couldn't concentrate on. But as the sun rose higher, I knew I had to check again. Maybe the snow would prove me wrong. Maybe the footprints were a trick of the light. Bundling up in my coat and boots, I stepped onto the porch and froze. The footprints were still there. And worse, now I could see them clearly. They didn't just lead up to the cabin. They circled it. The tracks started at the tree line, curved around the back of the cabin, looped around the far side, and ended where I had seen them last night. I crouched to inspect them. The prints were large, boot prints, and fresh enough that the edges were still crisp. Someone had walked around the cabin, watching it from every angle. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Straightening, I turned to face the forest. The trees stretched out in every direction, their bare limbs swaying faintly in the wind. The woods seemed endless, dark and alive. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt it. Eyes. Somewhere out there, someone was watching me. That evening, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I checked the locks on the doors and windows again, feeling ridiculous but unable to stop myself. For hours, I sat by the fire with the lights on, listening for any sound that didn't belong. By the time night fell, the storm had picked up. Snowflakes whipped against the windows, the wind howling like something alive. It should have been comforting, proof that no one could be out there now. But instead, the sound only made me feel more isolated. Around midnight, I finally crawled into bed, exhausted. The events of the last day swirled in my mind, refusing to let me sleep. I thought about the footprints, the deliberate way they circled the cabin. Why didn't they knock, I wondered. Why didn't they try to come in? It was almost worse. Whoever it was didn't want to be seen. They didn't want anything yet. They just wanted me to know they were out there. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, squeezing my eyes shut. Get some sleep, I told myself. Then in the silence, I heard it again. The footsteps. Inside the house. The footsteps were inside the house. I sat bolt upright in bed, every nerve in my body electrified. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd dreamed the sound. But then I heard it again. Soft, deliberate steps. Somewhere downstairs. I gripped the flashlight on the nightstand, hands trembling, and listened. The footsteps stopped, as if whoever, or whatever, it was, knew I was awake. The silence stretched impossibly long, thick enough to choke me. I didn't dare breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But where would I go? Outside, a snowstorm raged. There was no one for miles. After a minute that felt like an eternity, I slid out of bed as quietly as I could. The flashlight's beam shook as I aimed it at the bedroom door. My mind raced. What if it's still in the cabin? What if I walk right into it? Slowly, I crept downstairs. The living room was empty. The fire had died completely, the cabin's air frozen and still. I turned in slow circles, scanning every corner. Nothing. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The front door was open. Just a crack. Snow had blown in, covering the floor with a thin layer of white powder. I hadn't left it open. I knew I hadn't. I forced myself forward and slammed it shut, turning the lock so hard I nearly broke it. My pulse thundered in my ears as I searched the house, under the bed, in the closets, even behind the curtains. No one was there, no broken windows, no sign of forced entry. And yet, as I stood there in the middle of the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside, that someone was still watching me. The storm continued into the next day. I tried to keep myself busy, reading, making tea, staring blankly into the fire, but I couldn't stop looking out the windows. Every time I glanced outside, I expected to see someone standing there. By afternoon, the snow had eased up enough for me to step out onto the porch. My heart sank the moment I saw the ground. The footprints were back. This time, there were more of them. They crisscrossed the clearing, circling the cabin in chaotic loops. It was as if someone, or something, had been pacing around the house all night, over and over again. I followed them around to the back of the cabin, and that's when I saw it. A small, carved symbol on the back porch railing. It hadn't been there before, a rough, crude shape etched into the wood. It was a pair of eyes. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. Whoever this was, they weren't just watching me. They wanted me to know I was being watched. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with every light in the cabin turned on. The doors and windows were locked, the fire blazing, but none of it felt like enough. Every creak of the wood sent my heart racing. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking. Around 3 a.m., the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness. I froze, my flashlight shaking as I switched it on. Outside, the storm howled, shaking the windows. The fire in the fireplace flickered and popped, casting strange shadows across the walls. Then I heard it, the footsteps. They were inside again, just above me, in the attic. My breath came in short gasps as I backed toward the front door. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I just needed to get out. I grabbed my boots and coat, struggling to pull them on, but then I heard a sound that made me stop cold. A slow creaking sound. Someone was coming down the attic stairs. I couldn't move. My flashlight shook violently as I turned it toward the hallway. From where I stood, I couldn't see the attic door, but I could hear the slow, deliberate thud of footsteps descending one step at a time. Creak, thud, creak, thud. My vision blurred as panic clawed at my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. My mind screamed at me, "Move, Laura, move!" Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. I stood frozen, staring into the dark hallway. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and unsteady, and then finally, I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing at the edge of the hallway just out of the light. I couldn't see its face, only the outline of a tall, thin body. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I stumbled backward, a whimper escaping my lips. "What do you want?" I choked out. The figure didn't answer. Slowly, it tilted its head, like it was curious, like it was studying me. Then, without a sound, it stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. I don't remember much after that. I think I ran out into the storm. I remember snow in my boots, freezing air burning my lungs, the sting of branches whipping against my face as I stumbled through the woods. I don't know how long I ran before I saw headlights cutting through the dark. The hunters found me at the edge of the forest, half frozen and hysterical. I couldn't explain what had happened. I didn't even try. I'm back in New York now, but I don't feel safe. Not anymore. I keep my windows locked, my curtains drawn, but it doesn't help. Because sometimes late at night I hear footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes I see footprints in the snow outside my apartment window, and sometimes I wake up to the feeling of eyes on me, watching from the dark, whoever it was. They let me leave, but I know they'll be back.